call me on my cell phone. As a basic scientist, all my work is for nothing unless I provide you guys with new information on how to better treat your patients. So, can APRV prevent ARDS? Actually prevent it, not treat it. We're going to try to prevent it. And I've always found as a basic scientist that in order to come up with a solution to a problem, we have to think about the problem. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to think about the problem. The problem being, of course, we have to know the mechanism of ventilator-induced lung injury before we can treat it. And once we understand the mechanism of ventilator-induced lung injury, we have to deduce what components of the mechanical breath, APRV in particular for this lecture, can actually block or prevent these mechanisms. So we have to know what breaks the lung and then how to prevent the lung from being broken, if you will. Now my argument, I want to take a sort of a step back. My argument today is where I'm arguing that APRV with our very specific settings can reduce ARDS incidence. And those settings were those developed by Dr. Nader Herbashi. Just last year, we published a paper titled The Third Year Evolution of Airway Pressure Release Ventilation. And all of these 4 studies were defined as APRV. The first is by Stock and Downs in '87. They were the first to invent the breath. And then in '93, 2010, and 2013. And I think you don't have to look too far to see that these breaths are totally different. Just a few of the differences are there are difference in peak airway pressure, difference in end expiratory pressure, difference in inspiratory time, and difference in expiratory time. Yet every single one of these breaths in each of these papers were defined as APRV. So are all breaths defined as APRV equivalent? Not even close. They are much different, and we must study not just APRV as a mode, but the settings within the mode. And that's critical to understand because too many people, when they review APRV, put every breath, regardless of settings, into one big bag and try to analyze it. And of course, they get a lot of standard error when that occurs. It's just as important when you're doing volume assist control ventilation. You have to know the settings. Indeed, in the classic study in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2000, using the volume assist control mode, they demonstrated that just changing 2 parameters, tidal volume and plateau pressure, had a significant reduction in mortality. So the breath was identical except for 2 parameters, and that made all the difference. Same mode, different parameters. I recently did a pro-con with Dr. Kasmarek on the use of APRV in preventing ARDS. You would never see a pro-con on can volume assist control prevent ARDS because, as we all know, it's not the mode, but the settings within the mode. If we were going to discuss that, we would talk about the setting.
Still not hearing you. Can you make sure that your talk is connected?
It was connected, and it's off, and I didn't notice it went off. It should be working now?
Yeah, we can hear you now, thanks.
Okay, how far should I go back?
2 minutes.
Any suggestions?
It's indicating 4 slides.
Down, you said back 4 slides?
Yes. APRV-TCAV.
Okay.
Right about here.
Okay. What? Okay. So why do we call the settings that we use TCAV? This is a typical volume and or pressure and flow curve from using our breath settings, and we call it time control for the TC because we control the time at peak inspiration and have a very extended inspiration, and we control the time at expiration and a very short, minimal time at expiration. That's where we get the time controlled. The adaptive component is actually twofold. We use the slope of the expiratory flow curve in order to precisely titrate the time at expiration to be faster than the fastest collapse time constants of the alveoli to keep them open by time. Also, since we're just using our P high is really just an extended CPAP and with a quick release, if we put TCAV on a patient with established ARDS with just the CPAP, the tidal volume will be very low. As the lung recruits over time, the tidal volume will increase. So therefore, the tidal volume is not set by the clinician, but is adaptive to the changes in the lung volume. So our adaptive component using the slope of the expiratory flow curve and adaptively changing the tidal volume as the lung expands, not by setting it, but having the lung allow increases in volume as it expands. So what is TCAV? What are our settings? The ventilator components. We have open valve CPAP with a quick release. The open valve component of the CPAP is critical so the patient can either expire or inspire when they're in the CPAP mode of the breath. There are no triggers to deliver a mechanical tidal volume. So the patient can never trigger a mechanical breath above the CPAP level. So you can think of our TCAV as sort of dumb APRV. It is simply CPAP with a quick release. Our settings, we set P high sufficiently high enough to recruit alveoli, and there are various clinical criteria that we use to set P high. If we're converting from a conventional breath, we usually set P high at around the plateau pressure. The T high, the amount of time that we spend at inspiration, we try to extend to 90% of each breath. So the majority of the breath is spent at inspiration. The P low is always set at 0 for multiple reasons. One of the key ones that I can tell you about, because just for the length of time to get through the talk, is that we can't interpret the slope of the expiratory flow curve with any kind of added peak. So by having the peak by the P low set at 0, we get a very accurate slope of the expiratory flow curve, which is essentially the elastance changes of the lung. And this allows us to adjust the T low properly. Although we set P low at 0, the T low is always sufficiently short so that an end expiratory pressure remains in the lung. And that pressure is usually half of the P high. So if the P high is 20, the P low is usually around 10. If we're looking at that TCAV slide from our paper, the bottom is our breath. An extended time at inspiration, a very quick expiratory drop, or release, and then okay, my sound just went off again, but I just turned it back on, so hopefully I'm back online. For whatever reason, it keeps going on. But I'll try to stay aware that if it goes off, then I'll turn it right back on. So getting back to thinking about the problem, what is the mechanism of ventilator-induced lung injury? Basically, it's changing the inflated, homogeneously ventilated lung into a heterogeneously ventilated lung with normal alveoli filled with edema fluid, and alveoli that open and collapse with each breath, all within the same lung. And we understood this was a problem a long time ago. Back in 1992, Dr. Burkhard Lachman talked about how to treat established ARDS, and he said, open the lung and keep it open. However, this talk is about can APRV prevent ARDS, and therefore I think the strategy that we want to come up with is never give the lung a chance to collapse. So as soon as a patient is intubated, we should be using preemptive ventilation strategies that maintain that lung at a normal FRC and homogeneously ventilated. So what are the specific mechanisms that cause villi in this heterogeneous lung? There's really three basic at the alveolar level. There's dynamic strain, meaning the alveoli change volume greatly with each breath. Recruitment, de-recruitment. Stress concentrators. This occurs when there's areas of atelectasis or edema-filled alveoli that aren't involved in ventilation, that are surrounded by normal alveoli. And then overdistension. Alveoli next to these to alveoli that have high dynamic strain or stress concentration tend to overdistend. And I'm going to show you videos of all of these various mechanisms. First, let's start with dynamic alveolar strain. Our laboratory, again, we look at directly at subfloor alveoli in rat lungs. This is our microscope. This is the rat MDOR table. You can see here we have the chest open. The light source is right on the visceral pleura of the lung. And here we see the alveoli in real time with breath to breath, the kind of ventilatory mode that we want to use. And this is what we see when we look at normal alveoli. This is a normal lung, rat lung. You can see all these individual little balls here are the individual alveoli. And notice how slight changes in the size of these alveoli in the 2 dimensions that we can see with the microscope. So this is a beautiful, homogeneously ventilated lung that is very stable and would be very difficult to injure with the ventilator. Now I'm going to have to switch to a new bank of slides, and hopefully this will work. And it did. So what we did is we animated those normal alveoli. And again, it's about a 2% change with each breath. So here's what we see when we have a normal lung. All the alveoli have interconnected walls. They support each other. They're connected to each other. And there's very little movement in the 2 dimensions that we can see with tidal ventilation. Here's what happens in acute lung injury. These alveoli in the center have surfactant deactivation due to systemic inflammation, and now they become very unstable due to surfactant deactivation. Notice that they collapse and expand with each breath. They move a huge amount, a great deal of dynamic strain. Strain just means change in size. But also note, since the alveoli share walls, look what happens to the alveoli adjacent to the collapsing alveoli. They are greatly overdistended. So this has actually 2 of the mechanisms of villi, unstable alveoli and alveolar overdistension. And if you think about these alveoli in the middle, if you think about a paper clip, just take a paper clip and bend it back and forth 6 or 7 times, it's going to break. The same thing's going to happen to the cells in these alveoli. So let's move now on to stress concentrators. And to show you an example of what we mean by a stress concentrator, this is a board, and we're going to put a force in both the north and south direction. And these lines going through the board are lines of force. Here, this board has no defects. However, over these other boards have a square, a circle, and this wedge. And notice how those lines of force are concentrated around these stress concentrators. And that's where you're going to have your stress failure or your injury. The same thing occurred in a lung when you have areas of atelectasis or edema. So here we have a lung with all inflated homogeneous alveoli, and you can see the forces of stress are equally distributed throughout the lung. But look what happens here. We have an atelectatic portion, and now the lines of force are concentrated around that collapsed area. Whoops. Wrong one, here we go. So now we have this animated, and look with each breath, because, again, alveoli share walls, They're collapsed in the center. As you inhale and exhale with inspiration, expiration, notice the dynamic strain on the alveoli surrounding the stress concentrator, and also the overdistension of alveoli around the stress concentrator. So it appears to be, if we're thinking about the problem is ventilating a heterogeneous lung below FSC. The mechanisms, of course, being dynamic strain, stress concentrators, and alveolar overdistension. So the solution should be to open and stabilize lung. So it looks like we've found the problem, and the solution is easy: open and stabilize the lung. This would eliminate all of the mechanisms. If we open and stabilize the lung, there'd be no dynamic strain, stress concentrators, or overdistension. And so the question is TCAV the solution to this problem? I need to talk about one more physiologic component of alveolar inflation before we get into our data. And that's how the alveoli change volume in a dynamic fashion. And alveoli are not elastic in nature. They do not change a size like a balloon, such that you put in a centimeter water pressure and you get a millimeter expansion. It's in a one-to-one relationship. Alveoli are rather viscoelastic system. And what does that mean? In a viscoelastic system, there is a distinct time lag from the time to apply the force, and of course in a mechanical breath, the force is the tidal volume, until those alveoli begin to move. And also there is a time lag from when you remove the force during exhalation and the alveoli start to collapse. And this is a very important concept, and we think we can use this time lag to our advantage in order to open and stabilize alveoli. Now, the best way to describe and analyze a viscoelastic system is with a tool that we call the spring and dash pot. And here we have the spring and dash pot. Okay, the red bar is the force, and there's a rapid moving component and a slow moving component in the spring and dash pot system. So as you apply the force, parts of the tissue will expand rapidly and other parts will go very slowly. So how do we use this to our advantage in the APRV breath? Well, what we do is we put the force and then we hold it. So here's the tidal line, we hold it, and all the time we hold it, the alveoli continue to recruit. So look here. Here's the T high, and all the time you're at the T high, the dash pot is moving. In other words, the alveoli are recruiting. So we use this spring and dash pot concept of dynamic alveolar inflation, and we know that by extending the time at peak inspiration, we will continually recruit alveoli, understanding how a viscoelastic system functions. Okay, I don't think the one on the left is going to work, but what I did is we have a lung with ARDS, a rat lung. This is atelectasis, and then the pink is inflated, very heterogeneous classical ARDS. And we hold the inspiratory 1 second here. Essentially, we don't see any change. Actually, if we look at this one, we can actually see the whole thing playing out. This is 1 second is a typical inspiratory time for a conventional breath, whereas 5 seconds is a typical inspiratory time for an APRV breath. But notice if we start, we don't see any recruitment until about 2 seconds. So if we only have an inspiratory time of 1 second, we see no alveolar recruitment. However, look at how all the alveoli that recruit if we hold it for another 4 seconds. We see going from pink, from red to pink, all of these alveoli are recruited alveoli. And the only thing difference, the pressure in both of these was identical. The only thing difference is the time that the pressure is applied. So now let's look at the other end, the expiratory. How are we going to use our knowledge of viscoelastic alveolar collapse to stabilize alveoli? So if we remove the force, reinflate it very quickly, so we let the force come down, but then we re-exert it. This would be similar to a very quick collapse time or release time. So if we keep the expiratory duration short enough, that the dash pot or the alveolar walls don't have time to move, they don't have time to collapse. And so just by using the component of time, a very short expiratory time, understanding that alveoli are viscoelastic, we can have the breath come out and the alveolus not move. Okay, I'm at 41 and I have to get to 42. How do I do that? Slide number 42.
I'll get that for you right now.
Okay, so we're just waiting for new slides to be loaded and we'll get right back at it. So essentially, just the overview is that the mechanism of ventilator-induced lung injury at the alveolar level. We're going to be coming up our dynamic alveolar strain, stress concentrators, and alveolar overdistension. So if we can prevent all of those three villi mechanisms, we can essentially erase ventilator-induced lung injury as a blown, and I think significantly both reduce the incidence of ARDS if we apply it early, or if you apply this breath and open and stabilize the lung, you will significantly reduce mortality in the patient with established ARDS. So we're just waiting for the rest of the slides to load, and we should be okay. And here we go. Okay, again, I'll have to not load two movies into one slide next time. This is just showing evidence of the short expiratory duration. This is a rat lung with ARDS, and we have a short expiratory duration here, and actually stabilize these alveoli with time. You can see the alveoli are very stable throughout this cycle. Unfortunately, this one isn't working. The pressures are identical, except the expiratory duration is extended, and you can see these alveoli collapse. So, sort of an overview of the difference between the low tidal volume breath and the TCAV breath on the impact of alveolar recruitment. We start with a lung volume or an alveolus of this size, and if we don't have peaks set appropriately, we may lose alveolar recruitment over time. Also, we have a short inspiratory duration, so we may recruit some alveoli, but not many, because we know it takes a long time to recruit them, being viscoelastic bodies. And then we continue to de-recruit, so you can see it's sort of a progressive reduction in the size and the number of alveoli with this type of breath, which would be exacerbating the heterogeneous ventilation, which we know is the mechanism of ventilator-induced lung injury. On the other hand, since TCAV recruits throughout that inspiratory phase, we keep opening more and more and more lung with each breath. The short expiratory duration doesn't allow alveoli to collapse, so you can see the alveoli stays open during the expiratory phase, and we end up with a fully recruited, homogeneous ventilated lung. So it appears that TCAV is the solution. So now I'm going to show you some data supporting the hypothesis that early TCAV in both in translational animal model and in human trauma patients, and indeed reduce ARDS incidence. As I mentioned, we have a clinical laboratory. It's actually termed a translational laboratory because we try to apply everything that a septic patient would see in the ICU into our animal models. We use a large animal porcine model. As you can see, we use critical care grade ventilators, monitoring equipment. We use surviving sepsis, fluid and pressor resuscitation. We have the animal fully instrumented. We do coags, we do liver enzymes, we do CBC differential. We take all of the classical chemistries. We have our own blood gas machines, so we're measuring glucose, lactate, blood gases constantly. We measure urine output, we measure fluids in and fluids out. So it's very clinically applicable. And we've been criticized that a lot of our data on the impact or the positive impacts of TCAV come from animal models. But I want to make, the reason I went into sort of extensive explanation of the lab is this is not the typical animal model. This is not like a knockout mouse. It is the patient, in this case the pig, is treated almost identical to the way you treat your patients. The injury is a peritoneal sepsis and gut ischemia or perfusion, so we have a reperfusion injury and a septic injury, and we get wide spectrum antibiotics, and the progression, the pathogenesis in this model leads to multiple organ dysfunction, including abdominal compartment syndrome, stress ulcers, acute renal failure, and of course ARDS. So I just want to make the point that this is a very clinically relevant animal model I'm going to show you the data in. And and over the decades, there's been many animal models that have translated and directly improved human treatments for a number of diseases. So although a lot of our work is in animal models, there's a lot of evidence to show that animal models are very effective. So in this study, we looked at three animals, or three groups. We had APRVs using little applied after the animal desaturated, and a sham, which did not receive the injury, which was the peritonitis and the SMA and the ischemic perfusion. We have time on the X and PF ratio on the Y. So let's first look at the low tidal volume, and this is the one with the big dotted lines. And as you can see, at 21 hours, we hit the criteria for acute lung injury, which is a PF ratio less than 300. At 36 hours, we reached the criteria for ARDS, which was a PF ratio of less than 200. At the same time point, notice that our TCAV study was identical, a PF ratio to the control on room air. Here we had maxed out the ARDSNet protocol for the most part, and we're at a FiO2 of 100% and a PEEP at 24. This is sort of the take-home of, I think, the study. These were photos taken at necropsy. This is with the TCAV, and this is with the low tidal limb ARDSNet. You can see both these lungs are inflated to 25 centimeters of water pressure. You can see that this is a nice homogeneously ventilated lung. We never let the lung collapse. Here we have heterogeneous edema, atelectasis, along with some normally inflated portions. You can also see in the cut surface a gel-like edema in the interlobular spaces, and also the airway edema. Notice that the cut surface on the TCAV lung is perfectly normal, no edema in the interlobular spaces, and the airways are clean. I think interesting to all of you clinicians is that this particular animal was 60 liters fluid positive, and we still pulled out a normal lung. Now, why was that animal so fluid positive is because, unlike in a human study, this is a physiologic experiment, and we don't control for source. Therefore, we leave the fecal clot in the peritoneal cavity. So we want a raging inflammation to see if our ventilation strategies work. The fluids, the ins outs in the ARDSNet study were almost identical to that of the TCAV. So it wasn't the ventilation strategy was causing the massive increase in fluids, but rather the raging sepsis. But is important is that even with massive fluid resuscitation, we can still protect the lung with TCAV. Also, we don't measure tidal volume with APRV, but we do, we don't set it, but we do measure it, and it was around 12 cc's per kilo. And of course, this was low tidal volume, so it was around 6 cc's per kilo. And even with what would be considered injurious tidal volumes, you can see how protective the breath is. So why is this? How can everybody's going to say, my gosh, tidal volume, it has to be injurious? Because everyone knows that a high tidal volume causes damage. Well, remember what they're showing now, Dr. Amato and others, that it's not the tidal volume per se, but rather the driving pressure. And what is the measured driving pressure is to divide the compliance or the stiffness of the lung into the tidal volume. So here again, we look at our groups. This is a non-protective group, our APRV with our TCAV settings and low tidal volume. Now we're looking at driving pressure. And you can see, looking at the APRV group, we all start with a low driving pressure, 15. And the A group stays at low driving pressure for 48 hours, even though the non-protective had a tidal volume of 10, the low tidal had at 6, and this had a tidal volume of 12. Well, how could that be, you ask? Because of the compliance. Here we have the compliance, which was around 30 and 30 ml per centimeter of water compliance is normal for a 30 kilo pig. And notice in the APRV group using our TCAV settings that the compliance stayed normal. So that tidal volume is being blown in a fully inflated lung with normal compliance. Therefore, the driving pressure doesn't go up, and therefore that size tidal volume is not injurious. This was a meta-analysis that we did comparing patients at Maryland Shock Trauma that went on TCAV immediately upon intubation compared to 15 other locations from SICUs that use standard of care ventilation. So we looked at the bar and whiskers is the 15 other studies, and the little black circles are the results from Maryland Shock Trauma. So first we wanted to look at the ISS score to make sure that our patients are less injured than the other group 15, the other 15 studies, and you can see we're in the higher quartile. So that means our patients were as injured, more injured than in the other groups. The ARDS incidence, you can see that we're at the very bottom of the bar and whisker scale. The incidence of ARDS in the other 15 studies, 14%, at shock trauma was 1.3. Mortality, again, at the bottom of the scale, mortality was 14.1% in the other 15 studies, and only 3.6% in our group, and none of the patients died from ARDS. Another argument that is that the injury in the SICU is not conducive to ARDS as the injury in the MICU. So we looked at the LIP score, which is a lung injury prediction score, and the higher the number, the more percentage of patients that, the higher the odds are that your patient will develop ARDS. And in the study I just showed you from shock trauma, the LIP score was 8.7. Therefore, we should have had 35% of our patients should have developed ARDS, when only 1.3% actually did. So again, it shows the incredible ability of early preemptive mechanical ventilation to block progressive damage, actually reduce the incidence of ARDS. Now I'm going to show you what I said. I have here comes the boogeyman, because unfortunately many detractors of APRV look for studies and look for various instances where APRV might not be effective, rather than actually looking at the specific settings of each particular APRV node and trying to identify the optimal settings. So some of the common criticism of APRV are there are no randomized controlled trials. The spontaneous causes high transpulmonary pressures, there's high tidal volumes, and there's desynchrony, uncomfortable, and high sedations necessary. So let's start with the RCTs. This paper by Dr. Maxwell is an RCT that included low tidal volume and APRV. And they demonstrated that there was a trend for the APRV patients to have increased ventilator days. But what is often mentioned is that the authors themselves say that the reason for the increased ventilator days was because there was initially worse physiologic derangement in the APRV group, meaning the APRV patients were actually sicker. Also, there was a very recent RCT comparing low tidal volume to APRV, and this was just published this month. And they demonstrated that in the APRV there was improved oxygenation, respiratory system compliance, a decrease in plateau pressure, and reduction in the duration of mechanical ventilation and ventilatory stay. So now we do have a RCT demonstrating the efficacy of APRV over low tidal volume ventilation in ARDS patients. Also, I want to challenge some of the concepts of RCTs. And RCTs are man-made experimental protocols. And yet they are taught as if they were a physical law like the first law of thermodynamics. But RCTs, just like my work in basic science, there's problems with every single experimental protocol. We must recognize them and not take an RCT as the absolute proof that a various treatment strategy will work. This was evidenced in a very nice review by Dr. Fernandez in a paper, Evidence-Based Medicine. Is it a bridge too far? And what Dr. Fernandez mentioned or talked about in his paper was that RCTs often contribute to the failure of evidence-based medicine because of the internal validity, which means that in RCTs you take a very tight population of patients that fit all kinds of specific criteria, and maybe your RCT worked on that group of patients, but it doesn't translate to patients of all sizes, comorbidities, ages, the patients that you guys treat in the real world. And this was especially noted in complex pathophysiology such as ARDS and billing. So in future, Dr. Fernandez wants expert knowledge to be used as clinical decision making. And they points out that expert opinion is much different than expert knowledge, with expert knowledge being the knowledge that professionals gain over a decade or an entire career of real-life patients with all comorbidities, ages, and sexes, which would give external validity. And again, emphasize, Dr. Fernandez wants in the future the inclusion of expert knowledge in clinical decision making, and expert knowledge is one thing that we have a great deal of. TCAV is the primary mode of mechanical ventilation at our Adams Cowley Shock Trauma in Maryland. So it's not that we're wondering if this works. This is a everyday ventilatory application shock trauma. The criteria for TCAV is intubation. Everyone that's intubated goes on TEEG immediately. And Dr. Nader Avashi, who is the medical director, himself has over 1 million hours on ventilating patients with TCAV. And add that to all of his respiratory therapies, therapists and his faculty. So they have a massive amount of time ventilating with TCAV. Thus, these data are externally validated because they take all comers, of course. Everybody in the ICU, regardless of comorbidity, goes on TCAV. I showed you the TCAV paper where we had ARDS incidence reduced 1.3 and mortality to 1.4%. And we have some very interesting data showing that if we put TCAV on brain dead patients, that we increase transcranial lungs by approximately 680%. Unfortunately, this data isn't published yet, but there is a great deal of expert knowledge demonstrating that TCAV is a highly effective preemptive ventilation strategy to prevent the occurrence of or reduce the incidence of ARDS. Are RCTs essential for ventilator strategies? Well, actually, no, they're not. This was a paper by Tom Petty, Dr. Tom Petty. He was one of the first four authors on the first paper to identify ARDS as a syndrome. And in this paper, Dr. Petty said, to date, no controlled clinical trials have ever been done to learn if PEEP improves survival. I doubt if one will ever be proposed as once I did. So we use PEEP all the time, and there's never been an RCT that says that it'll improve survival. So would anyone say that it would be a good idea to have a clinical trial to test PEEP in ARDS patients? we'd have a control group, 0 PEEP, and then we would have a treatment group of patients with ARDS with PEEP. And I'd like any of you guys to raise your hands if you guys want to be in the control group, because we all know that PEEP is highly effective. So our RCTs and EMVs suggesting low tidal volume will reduce ARDS mortality working. So we have a number of RCTs and recent EMVs suggesting we should use low tidal volume. But are they working? Let's actually go back and analyze the data. I just took 4 of the more recent overviews and reviews of the topic of mortality with ARDS from 2009, 16, and from 2017. The market paper in Journal of Respiratory Care. And notice mortality is all around 40%, 40, 40, 36. That's just the way, if you average the mortalities from the various stages of ARDS, they're averaging around 40%. Dr. Villar and Kasmerek, in a recent publication, again, 8% mortality. If we take, if we look at the ARDSNet's own studies, the ARDSNet, Love, Express, Alien, Oscar, and Oscillate, remember the control group now is low tidal volume. So if you look at, if you average these up, the low tidal volume groups have a mortality of 37.3%. If you recall, when we had the low tidal volume study, tidal volume for the low tidal volume was 31%, and for the high was 39%. It appears we're going backwards. In 2000, we had a mortality of 31. We should have less than mortality than 31% now in 2017, and yet we're still up with around a 40% mortality, equal to that in the 12 cc's per kilo group. And yet in May of this year, we had an evidence-based medicine was released, and again they recommended that low tidal volume should be used. And with all of the data out there suggesting that we're still at a mortality of 40%, if we ask the question, does low tidal volume reduce mortality, are we fooling ourselves? Because the data just doesn't support that. Just this month in JAMA, there was a paper comparing lung recruitment and titrated PEEP to the low PEEP strategy for protective lung ventilation, and they demonstrated that with lung recruitment and titrated PEEP, there was an increase in 28-day all-cause mortality. And there was a editorial on this paper by Dr. Brower, and I'd like to read that to you. And Dr. Brower stated that since 4 large random clinical trials of strategies designed to promote lung recruitment have failed, perhaps the door on open lung approach should be allowed to close so that clinical and research community can move on to other potentially more effective strategies. TCAVs. So let's move on to spontaneous breathing causes high transpulmonary pressure. Well, spontaneous breathing causes high transpulmonary pressure regardless of the ventilatory mode. As you all know, paralysis of patients with controlled ventilation actually improve mortality, such that infers that spontaneous breathing with volume control was actually increasing mortality. And so regardless of the mode, if you have a collapsed lung, you're going to have a strong respiratory drive. Your brain, you're going to have a high CO2, low O2. Your receptors on the lung are going to be all telling the brain that I need to be inflated, and you're going to have a very high respiratory drive. So the only thing you can do logically at that point is to paralyze and sedate until you reopen the lung and drop that expiratory drive. What we found is properly applied TCAV, if you never give the lung to collapse, you will never have the stretch receptors telling the lung that it needs to be inflated, and you won't have high CO2s or low O2s. So you really will not have a strong inspiratory effort if you keep the lung open. Dr. Kasmerek had a published paper in Respiratory Care on his pro-con a couple years ago. And under the APRV and comfort section, Dr. Kasmerek stated that spontaneous breathing in APRV is not as straightforward as spontaneous breathing in simple CPAP. During CPAP, there's no question that synchrony is better than any other ventilatory mode. However, With our TCAV settings, it is simply open valve CPAP with a quick release. That's all it is. It's just CPAP. So there, by Dr. Kaczmarek's own description, there's no question that the synchrony should be better than this mode than in any other. So again, emphasizing that strong inspiratory efforts are also harmful in the volume control ventilation. This was the recently published study in 2010 showing that neuromuscular blockade reduced ARDS incidence. And again, the conclusion was that strong spontaneous breath increased mortality in patients on volume assist control. So it isn't just ARDS, it just isn't APRV or TCAV, it's any mechanical breath spontaneous breathing can cause problems. This is a paper by Calais, and again, using volume control mode and low tidal volume, they found that spontaneous breathing efforts during ARDS may enhance pulmonary edema. So I just want to point out that there's nothing unique about high spontaneous breathing with APRV or TCAV versus volume control mode. If you have a patient that doesn't have a lung open up and they're on TCAV and they do have a strong inspiratory drive, you're going to have to paralyze the sedate. This paper by Newman is often used to criticize APRV, and what they demonstrate is that they have a transponder pressure of 31 because there's an peak airway pressure of 20 or CPAP of 20, and the patient is actually pulling a negative 11 because they're having a strong inspiratory drive. However, the settings were a P high of 4 seconds. They set a P low, positive P low of 5, and the T low was a long, full 1 second long. So therefore, this was not the TCAV, our TCAV breath at all, and it was only one patient for 30 seconds. And the authors of the paper said nothing about the injurious components of this negative inspiratory drive. So high tidal volumes with APRV can cause injury. Remember, it's not just the absolute size of the tidal volume, but rather the size of the tidal volume in relation to the volume of the lung being ventilated. Remember our driving pressure equation. Okay, this. Okay, anyway, I'm only going to be able to show you. I'm only going to be able to show you this is just tidal volume 6. For some reason it got duplicated here. But this is tidal volume of 6 in a rat lung that has the heterogeneous injury. And you can see that entire tidal volume is going into this one area. So even though you're low tidal volume, you're overdistending this portion of the lung. And unfortunately, the other video I can see behind here, but I can't move it, so we're not going to be able to show you the totally recruited lung. So again, remember that driving pressure is equal to the tidal volume over the compliance. And for APRV, we have a low driving pressure throughout because we have good tidal volume or compliance throughout. We keep the lung open and stable. Therefore, if the lung's going to tolerate a large tidal volume because the compliance is so normal. Lastly, to stay uncomfortable and high sedation, and I just want to show you a patient at shock trauma. They're on TCAV and they are walking down the hallway. So surely this patient does not have a great deal of synchrony, a great deal of uncomfort, and they surely are not highly sedated. And this is done all the time at shock trauma. So these patients on TCAV are up and walking down the hall. So at shock trauma, this is a very common occurrence, and I think if a movie's worth 1,000 words, this is how comfortable and that TCAV can be on these seriously injured patients. So my conclusion is yes, TCAV can reduce ARDS incidence. As you saw from the video, it's comfortable to be applied to all patients as soon as they're intubated. It is simply CPAP with a quick release. You must remember the settings, that all APRV are not the same settings, and you have to be very specific to what you're looking at. Therefore, there is no dysynchrony problem. It solves the problem. If we analyze the problem is heterogeneous lung collapse. It solves the problem by never letting the lung a chance to collapse. It keeps the lung open, inflated, and homogeneous. It uses our understanding of the viscoelastic nature of alveoli. In other words, the longer time that you the force, the more alveoli. And if you can release the force in a short enough period of time, you don't give the alveoli time to collapse. So the extended inspiratory time nudges open alveoli with each breath, and the minimal expiratory time does not give the lung time to collapse. We keep an open and stable lung, which eliminates some mechanisms of billet, which is dynamic strain stress concentrators, and also eliminate that strong respiratory drive so you don't have any dysynchrony problems. It's personalized and adaptive. For lung stabilization, we set the expiratory duration by breath changes in lung elastance using the expiratory flow curve, and we don't set a tidal volume. As the lung gets larger, and we just have CPAP, the tidal volume gets larger. If the lung gets smaller and starts to collapse, the tidal volume gets smaller. So essentially, the lung decides its own tidal volume. We have solid support on the mechanism TCAV and its efficacy from our clinically relevant animal models. And we have solid expert experience and also the meta-analysis on clinical efficacy. So again, the goal of this talk was to improve patient care. So hopefully I have demonstrated how what a powerful tool a preemptive TCAV can be in reducing the incidence of ARDS and acute lung injury. And just remember that this is sort of our strategy is not the norm, it's not typical. We actually believe that this is a better strategy than the current standard of care, which is low tidal volume, and we believe that because of the evidence from the literature. So I just want you to leave you with this quote from Steve Prefontaine, is that just because they are the many and we are the few doesn't make them right. So please analyze the data and make your decision on the data, not on if the majority of the people are saying something else. So bottom line, can TCAV prevent ARDS? At least in our patients, if we apply preemptive TCAV, our patients, our lungs anyway, are very healthy. But if we use low tidal volume ventilation, not so much. So with that, I will turn it back over to the moderators, and I think there is a question and answer period at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Neiman. Thank you very much. And I am going to bring over a chat pod, and let's see what people have to say here.
That number for you? I thought they sort of.
I don't know how.